The images from the Mars Defense Station showed what remained of Outpost 7, a sprawling crater where a thriving research facility had stood just hours before. Admiral Helena Chen stared at the holographic display, her expression carefully neutral despite the horror churning in her stomach. The attack had come without warning, and their most advanced weapons hadn't even scratched the invaders. "Play it again," she ordered, and the footage rolled once more. The Meridian swarm vessels, if you could call them vessels, moved like liquid metal, their surfaces rippling and flowing as they absorbed every round of plasma fire, every electromagnetic pulse, every quantum disruption beam the outpost had thrown at them. Not only had the weapons failed to harm them, but the mysterious entities had seemed to grow stronger with each attack. "They're not just resistant to our weapons," Dr. Raj Patel said, stepping forward from the group of scientists gathered in the emergency command center. "They're feeding on them, converting our energy directly into mass and complexity." The xenophysicist's usually steady hands trembled as he manipulated the holographic controls, highlighting the structural changes in the swarm entities. Each attack makes them more sophisticated, more adaptable. "Like technological antibodies," someone muttered from the back of the room. The loss of Outpost 7 had been bad enough, but the real gut punch had come 12 hours later. The Arcturus Alliance, humanity's strongest alien allies, had broadcast a warning across all frequencies before going dark. Their entire defense fleet, the most advanced in known space, had been destroyed in minutes. "We're looking at it wrong," a voice said from the doorway. All heads turned to see Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, her lab coat wrinkled from too many hours hunched over computers. The theoretical physicist wasn't part of the military command structure, but she'd earned her place in these meetings through sheer brilliance. "The more sophisticated our weapons, the stronger they become," she continued, walking to the holographic display. "So maybe," she paused, a strange light in her eyes, "maybe we need to think simpler." Admiral Chen raised an eyebrow. "Simpler than plasma cannons and quantum disruptors." "Much simpler." Mackenzie's fingers flew over the controls, pulling up historical images that seemed absurdly out of place. Ancient siege engines, mechanical traps, simple machines. "We're fighting them with energy that they can absorb and repurpose. But what if we fought them with physics they can't convert? Pure kinetic force, mechanical advantage, the basic laws of motion." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Fighting an advanced alien threat with primitive technology seemed ludicrous, but then again, humanity had a long history of turning apparent disadvantages into strengths. "The swarm adapts to energy weapons because they can analyze and replicate the underlying principles," Mackenzie explained. "But you can't adapt to a rock moving at relativistic speeds. You can't absorb and repurpose a mechanical spring or a counterweight. Physics is physics." Admiral Chen studied the ancient warfare diagrams with new eyes. "You want to fight space-age enemies with Stone-Age weapons. I want to fight them with principles so fundamental they can't be countered," Mackenzie corrected. "Every sophisticated defense they've developed is based on handling energy attacks. They've never had to deal with simple mechanical force." It was crazy. It was primitive. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had helped humanity survive countless challenges throughout history. "How quickly can you adapt these concepts for space warfare?" Chen asked. Mackenzie's smile was fierce. "Give me 48 hours and a team of engineers who remember their classical mechanics. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." As the meeting broke up into focused working groups, Chen couldn't help but appreciate the irony. Humanity, often dismissed as primitives by more advanced species, might save the galaxy precisely because they remembered how to think simply. The swarm had evolved to counter the most sophisticated weapons in known space, but they'd never faced an enemy willing to throw rocks. Very, very fast rocks. The real question was whether they could implement these ideas before the swarm reached Earth. They had less than a week to turn ancient warfare into humanity's most advanced defense strategy. The fate of not just Earth, but possibly the entire galaxy, would depend on their ability to think backward in order to move forward. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie sat in the corner of the nearly empty coffee shop 3 blocks from the Space Defense Command, surrounded by paper notebooks. Actual paper, which had earned her more than a few strange looks from the baristas. In a world of holographic displays and quantum computers, she preferred to do her most important thinking the old-fashioned way. Right now, those notebooks were filled with sketches of ancient warfare devices reimagined for space combat. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up to find Captain Michael Torres, one of the few survivors from the Mars attack, holding 2 fresh cups of coffee. The dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd been sleeping about as much as she had. "Only by failed ideas," she said, sweeping aside some crumpled papers. "Please tell me one of those is for me." He handed her a cup and sat down, glancing at her drawings. "Is that a trebuchet?" "Modified for zero-G operation," she confirmed. "The principles are the same, using mechanical advantage to launch projectiles. But instead of counterweights, we're working with magnetic acceleration and momentum exchange." Torres picked up one of the sketches, studying it with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years in space combat. No power signature for them to detect or absorb. No energy weapons for them to feed on. He paused, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This is brilliant. The problem is scale," Sarah said, pulling out another notebook. "We need to deliver enough kinetic energy to damage their structural integrity, but without using any form of energy they can detect or absorb. And we need to do it across space warfare distances." Torres set down his coffee, suddenly animated. "What about distribution? Instead of one big hit, we use thousands of smaller ones." Sarah finished, already sketching. "Like space buckshot. Their adaptive capabilities work on analyzing and countering energy patterns. They've never had to deal with pure mechanical dispersion." The next few hours flew by as they worked, combining her theoretical knowledge with his practical combat experience. The coffee shop slowly filled and emptied again as they covered page after page with designs. Kinetic dispersal weapons, mechanical trigger mechanisms, gravity-assisted launch systems that used planetary motion itself as a power source. "Look at this," Torres said, pointing to a simulation he pulled up on his tablet, one of their few concessions to modern technology. "If we position launchers here, and here, we can use Jupiter's gravity well to accelerate the projectiles naturally. No energy signature at all." Sarah was already calculating the trajectories. "And if we time it right with the orbital mechanics, we could have continuous coverage of the entire inner solar system using nothing but natural forces they can't possibly adapt to." "Because you can't adapt to gravity," Torres said. "It just is." Their excitement was interrupted by an alert from Space Command. The swarm had just been detected passing Saturn's orbit. They were running out of time. "We need to scale this up immediately," Sarah said, gathering her notebooks. "And we need to convince Command this isn't completely insane." Torres stood, a determined glint in his eye. "After what I saw on Mars, insane might be exactly what we need. Sometimes the best solutions come from thinking completely differently." As they hurried back to Command, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. Here they were, facing the most advanced threat humanity had ever encountered, and their best hope lay in principles so basic they were taught in high school physics. The real challenge would be implementation. They had countless theoretical solutions sketched out in those notebooks, but turning them into practical weapons would require something humanity had always excelled at: improvisation. "You know what's really going to drive them crazy," Torres said as they walked. "They won't be able to learn from this. Every time we destroy one of them, the others won't be able to adapt because there's nothing to adapt to. It's just physics." "Sometimes," Sarah replied, thinking of all those simple sketches that might save humanity, "the most elegant solution is also the simplest." Back at Command, they found Admiral Chen waiting for them. One look at her face told them something had changed. "The Arcturus survivors sent new data," she said without preamble. The swarm isn't just adapting anymore. They're evolving, creating new forms specifically designed to handle energy-based threats. She looked at the notebooks in Sarah's hands. "Please tell me you have something." Sarah opened her notebook to a page filled with sketches of ancient warfare devices reimagined for the space age. "Admiral," she said, "how would you like to win this war with high school physics?" As they laid out their plans, Sarah couldn't help but think that humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to think differently. While the swarm evolved to handle increasingly complex energy weapons, humanity would go back to basics. Sometimes the best way forward was to take a step back. The space around Jupiter's largest moon, Ganymede, looked like a junkyard. Hundreds of mechanical launchers, each one stripped of every non-essential electronic component, floated in carefully calculated orbits. They looked primitive, almost crude, and that was exactly the point. Captain Michael Torres stood at the command station of the U.S. Nightingale, watching as the last of the launchers moved into position. The ship's electronic emissions were dampened to near-zero levels, running on minimal power to avoid detection. Around them, the rest of Earth's defensive fleet maintained similar radio silence, waiting. "Status report." Admiral Chen's voice came through on an old-style radio frequency, another adaptation designed to minimize their energy signature. "Final launchers in position," Torres reported. "Gravity assists calculated and locked in. We're as ready as we'll ever be." Dr. Sarah Mackenzie floated near the tactical display, double-checking their calculations one last time. The entire operation depended on precise orbital mechanics, using Jupiter's massive gravitational field to accelerate their projectiles to speeds that would have required enormous energy expenditure to achieve artificially. "Contact." The sensor operator's whispered warning sent a jolt through the bridge. Multiple swarm entities entering the outer system. They're bigger than before. The tactical display showed the truth of it. The swarm had evolved, just as they'd feared. Their liquid metal forms had grown more complex, more elaborate, bristling with structures clearly designed to absorb and redirect energy weapons. "All ships maintain emission silence," Chen ordered. "Let them come to us." The minutes crawled by as the swarm approached. They moved with absolute confidence, their previous encounters having taught them that nothing in known space could harm them. Every weapon ever used against them had only made them stronger. "They're scanning for energy signatures," Sarah observed, watching their movement patterns. "Looking for the kinds of defenses they expect us to have." "But they're not finding any," Torres added with grim satisfaction, "because we're not using any." The swarm entities entered the kill zone, the region where Jupiter's gravity well would give their simple weapons the most devastating effect. For a moment, everything hung in perfect stillness. "Execute Operation Pandora," Chen commanded. Torres gave the signal, not an electronic pulse or coded transmission, but a simple flash of light from the ship's running lights. Across the battlefield, mechanical triggers engaged. There was no energy burst, no dramatic release of power, just the silent operation of simple machines, working exactly as they had since the principles of leverage and momentum were first discovered. The first wave of projectiles was almost invisible, thousands of small objects, accelerated by nothing more complex than gravity and mechanical force. The swarm didn't even try to evade. Why should they? Every weapon they'd encountered had been energy-based, something they could absorb and adapt to. But you couldn't adapt to a rock moving at relativistic speeds. The impacts were spectacular. The first wave struck the leading swarm entities, simple kinetic force overwhelming their sophisticated defenses. Their liquid metal forms couldn't absorb or redirect pure mechanical energy. Where energy weapons had made them stronger, these primitive projectiles simply tore through them. Multiple direct hits, the tactical officer reported, unable to keep the amazement from his voice. Swarm entities showing actual damage. The swarm's response was immediate and revealing. They tried to adapt, their surfaces rippling as they attempted to analyze and counter this new threat. But there was nothing to analyze. No energy pattern to decode, No complex technology to understand and absorb, just the basic, immutable laws of physics. Second wave launching, Tor is called. This time, the projectiles were larger, their trajectories calculated to use the debris from the first wave as additional ammunition. Simple physics turned into a cascade of destruction. They're trying to retreat, Sarah noted, watching their erratic movements. They've never retreated before. Because they've never faced anything they couldn't adapt to, Chen replied. Until now. But the swarm's retreat was cut off by the operation's second phase. As they tried to withdraw, they encountered fields of simple mechanical mines. Devices that needed no power source, gave off no energy signature, and operated on nothing more complex than spring tension and inertia. Look at their formation, Torres said, pointing to the tactical display. They're breaking up, losing cohesion. They can't maintain their liquid metal state under this kind of purely physical assault. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than an hour. When it was over, the space around Ganymede was littered with a different kind of debris, the shattered remains of entities that had thought themselves invincible. As the dust settled, Sarah floated to the observation window, staring out at their improvised weapons. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "We did more than that," Torres said, joining her. "We proved they can be beaten. Not with advanced technology, but with the most basic principles of physics. Principles so fundamental they can't be countered or adapted to." Admiral Chen's voice came over the radio again. "All ships, report damage and casualties." The responses came back one by one. Minimal damage, no casualties. Their primitive weapons had been completely effective, while giving the swarm nothing to absorb or adapt to. "Dr. Mackenzie," Chen said, "I believe you and Captain Torres have just revolutionized space warfare by going back to basics. The question is, can we implement this on a larger scale before they try again?" Sarah looked at her notebook, filled with even more designs they hadn't had time to build. "Admiral," she said, "I think we're just getting started." As the fleet began collecting data and debris for analysis, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. The most advanced threat humanity had ever faced had been defeated not by pushing technology forward, but by remembering their roots. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem wasn't to mash complexity with complexity, but to cut through it with elegant simplicity. The Grand Council chamber of the Arcturus Alliance had never seen anything quite like this presentation. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie stood before representatives of 17 advanced civilizations, explaining how humanity had succeeded where their sophisticated weapons had failed, with a hologram of a trebuchet floating behind her. "The fundamental problem," she explained, gesturing to the ancient siege engine, "was that we were all trying to defeat the swarm with energy they could absorb and repurpose. But sometimes the simplest solution is the most effective." The Arcturian High Commander, their crystalline form shimmering with skepticism, spoke first. "You defeated an advanced hostile species with primitive mechanical devices." "There's nothing primitive about physics," Captain Torres interjected, stepping forward. "The principles we used are the same ones that govern the movement of planets and stars. The swarm could adapt to our energy weapons because energy can be transformed. But you can't adapt to momentum. You can't negotiate with inertia." The chamber erupted in overlapping discussions, each species adding their own perspective to the debate. Admiral Chen watched from her position near the podium, noting how the initial skepticism was gradually giving way to understanding. "We've received reports," a Centaurian delegate announced, their tentacles writhing with excitement, "that the swarm is actively avoiding systems where these mechanical defenses have been deployed. They've never shown fear before. Because they've never encountered something they couldn't adapt to," Sarah explained. "Every other weapon made them stronger. But these," she brought up footage from the Jupiter battle, "these just break them." The implications were revolutionary. Species that had been on the brink of extinction began to see hope. The Arcturian High Commander rose, their crystalline surface pulsing with what humans had learned to recognize as deep thought. "We have vast manufacturing capabilities," they said, "if you would share these designs." "That's why we're here," Chen replied. "The swarm is a threat to all of us. We're proposing a unified defense strategy, not based on advanced technology, but on the fundamental forces of nature itself." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as humanity shared their designs with their alien allies. Each species brought their own perspective, their own understanding of physics and engineering. The Centaurians, with their mastery of fluid dynamics, suggested modifications to improve the projectile dispersal patterns. The crystalline Arcturians, understanding structural integrity better than most, helped refine the impact geometries. "Look at this," Sarah said to Torres, showing him a modification proposed by one of the alien engineers. "They've taken our basic kinetic launcher design and improved its efficiency by 300% without adding any detectable energy signatures." Torres studied the design, impressed. "They're not just copying our ideas, they're building on them, making them better." Across the chamber, different species were working together, combining their unique perspectives to enhance the effectiveness of humanity's primitive weapons. The Arcturians' crystalline manufacturing techniques could produce projectiles with perfect mass distribution. The Centaurians' understanding of fluid dynamics led to improved delivery systems. "We're receiving new reports," an aide announced, rushing into the chamber. "The swarm is retreating from multiple sectors. They're abandoning territory they've held for months." The news sent a ripple of excitement through the gathered representatives. Admiral Chen stepped to the central platform, her voice carrying across the chamber. "For too long, we've been fighting this war separately, each trying to overcome the swarm with our most advanced technology. But sometimes advancement means remembering our foundations." She gestured to the various species working together. "Today we begin fighting together, not with our most sophisticated weapons, but with the most basic principles of physics. Principles that cannot be countered because they are woven into the fabric of space-time itself." As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself working with a young Arcturian engineer, their crystalline appendages carefully manipulating a holographic model of a new delivery system. "It's fascinating," the Arcturian said, their surface rippling with what Sarah had learned was their equivalent of enthusiasm. "Your species, often considered one of the youngest and least advanced, has taught us all something profound about the nature of progress." "Sometimes," Sarah replied, thinking of her paper notebooks and simple sketches, "the best way forward is to remember where you came from." The chamber had become a hub of interspecies cooperation, each civilization contributing their unique understanding to improve upon humanity's basic designs. The swarm had intended to destroy them all individually, but instead had united them, forcing them to find strength in simplicity. As she watched the various species working together, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. The swarm's greatest mistake hadn't been attacking humanity. It had been assuming that technological sophistication was the same thing as advancement. They had never considered that true innovation sometimes meant looking backward to move forward. "You know what's really remarkable," Torres said, joining her at the observation window. "We're not just sharing technology. We're sharing perspective. Each species sees these basic principles differently, and together we're creating something entirely new. Based on something very old," Sarah added, patting her ever-present notebook. The future of galactic defense was being built on principles so ancient they predated humanity's written history, and somehow that felt exactly right. The message arrived on all frequencies simultaneously, its structure unlike anything their systems had encountered before. Dr. Sarah Mackenzie stood in the command center of the International Space Defense Station, watching as the AI translation matrices struggled to decode it. "This is Voice of Many, speaking for what you call the swarm," the message finally resolved. "We request dialogue." Admiral Chen, Captain Torres, and representatives from the Arcturus Alliance gathered in the station's main conference room, tension thick in the air. The holographic display showed a swirling mass of liquid metal, a swarm entity, but different from any they'd encountered before. Its surface rippled with complex patterns that the xenolinguists suggested were a form of communication. "You have done what we thought impossible," the entity continued. "You have forced us to evolve in ways we never anticipated. By devolving our technology," Torres asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "By showing us our fundamental misconception," Voice of Many replied. "We believed evolution meant increasing complexity. We consumed energy, grew more sophisticated, adapted to every weapon used against us. But you," the entity's surface shifted, forming patterns that somehow conveyed respect. "You showed us that true adaptation sometimes means returning to basics." Sarah leaned forward, her mind racing. "You're not just talking about our weapons, are you? Your species fascinated us from our first encounters. While others tried to match our complexity, you chose simplicity. When faced with energy weapons you couldn't defeat, you returned to fundamental physics. When confronted with adaptive technology, you employed immutable principles." The Arcturian High Commander's crystalline form pulsed with realization. "They weren't just attacking us," they said. "They were testing us." "We evolved beyond our original creators eons ago," Voice of Many confirmed. "We sought to understand if other species could make the same leap, not by increasing complexity, but by recognizing when to embrace simplicity." Sarah thought of her paper notebooks, of ancient warfare principles reimagined for space combat. "That's why our simple weapons worked. You couldn't adapt to them because we had evolved so far toward complexity that we had forgotten our own foundations," the entity completed. "Each energy weapon used against us was absorbed, analyzed, and incorporated. We grew ever more sophisticated, but also more rigid in our thinking. You reminded us that true evolution isn't always about adding complexity. Sometimes it's about remembering your roots." Admiral Chen's expression remained cautious. "And now we understand that we had become trapped in our own evolution. Your species, by maintaining connection to your primitive past while reaching for the stars, showed us a different path. We propose an exchange of knowledge." The conference room erupted in overlapping discussions. The entity's surface rippled, waiting patiently as the various species debated among themselves. Finally, Sarah stepped forward. "What kind of exchange?" "We offer our understanding of energy manipulation and adaptive technology. In return, we seek to learn your perspective. How to balance advancement with fundamentals, how to know when complexity serves progress, and when it hinders it." The Arcturian High Commander's surface flickered with their species' equivalent of laughter. "The most advanced species in known space wants to learn primitive warfare techniques. We want to learn balance," Voice of Many corrected. "Your species, humanity, maintains libraries of ancient books alongside quantum computers. You build spacecraft while remembering how to craft with your hands. You reach the stars without losing touch with your foundations. This is an evolution we never achieved." Admiral Chen looked at Sarah, at Torres, at the assembled representatives of multiple species. "You're not just talking about warfare anymore, are you? War was our method of testing, of seeking species who could teach us what we have forgotten. In humanity, we found not just an enemy clever enough to defeat us, but teachers who could show us how to evolve by remembering." Sarah pulled out her notebook, paper and pen, ancient technology in an age of quantum computing. "Then let's begin with the basics," she said, opening to a fresh page. "Sometimes the best way to move forward is to take a step back." The entity's surface rippled with what they would later learn was joy. Around the conference table, representatives of the most advanced species in known space watched as humanity prepared to teach the fundamentals of physics to an entity that could manipulate the fabric of space-time. Torres leaned close to Sarah, speaking softly. "You know what's really remarkable? We didn't just change how they wage war. We changed how they think about evolution itself." "Because sometimes," Sarah replied, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led them here, "the most advanced solution is remembering where you started." As she began to sketch out basic principles of mechanics, Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. Humanity, often dismissed as primitives by more advanced species, had ended up teaching one of the most sophisticated entities in the galaxy the value of simplicity. In doing so, they hadn't just prevented a war. They had opened a door to a new kind of evolution, one that recognized that progress wasn't always a straight line forward. Sometimes, the best way to reach the stars was to remember what it felt like to look up at them from the ground.